I'm Ethan, 27 years old, and I've never been what you'd call the favourite. Not the golden child, not the pride of the family, not even the one who gets invited to group photos without a reminder. My older brother, Jason, 34, has always worn that invisible crown. The successful one, the married one, the one who gave my parents grandkids, which apparently makes him the only person in our bloodline who counts anymore. I used to brush it off. I told myself I was just the quieter one, more independent, the black sheep in the charming, misunderstood way. But it wasn't charming, and it stopped being tolerable the moment my parents made it clear financially and emotionally that I was just a bonus character in a story where Jason was the star. I didn't expect anything when my grandfather died. That man was a ghost for most of my life. Some mysterious old figure who lived 3 states away and sent the same birthday card every year. A generic best wishes with a crisp $20 bill inside. But apparently, he had been paying attention. He'd seen what I didn't even know he was watching. The Christmases where I was handed socks while Derek's kids tore open drones and tablets. The Thanksgivings where I carved the turkey, cleaned the dishes, and still sat at the kids' table while Derek gave toasts about family values. The birthdays forgotten, the calls never returned. The years I spent building my own life from scratch, working 2 jobs in my early 20s, getting a degree online, skipping holidays because I couldn't afford the gas to drive home, while Jason got help in the form of loans that were never expected to be paid back. My grandfather noticed all of it, and in the end he left me something I didn't even know existed, a sizable inheritance. The call came on a Tuesday. I was in the middle of making lunch. Nothing fancy, just eggs and toast. And my mum called out of the blue. "No, how are you?" "No small talk, just so your grandfather's attorney called. You're getting a pretty big check." I blinked. Literally didn't know how to respond. "Wait, what?" I said, half laughing. I thought she was joking. My mum doesn't joke. "He left you the house," she said, like it tasted sour in her mouth. "And the investment account. Derek's only getting the boat." That was it. That was the beginning. I could almost hear the storm clouds forming through the silence on the other end of the line. She didn't congratulate me, didn't ask how I felt, just this flat, cold pause. "Then you know your brother could use that money more than you. He has kids, Ethan." It wasn't even subtle. That line haunted me for days. He has kids. As if that fact alone invalidated everything I'd done to get where I was. As if being single, child-free, and living in a modest 1-bedroom apartment disqualified me from receiving kindness or fairness. I didn't even know how much the inheritance was at that point. I hadn't called the attorney yet, but she had clearly, and so had Jason, because 2 days later I got a text from him. No greeting, no preamble. "You know you owe this to me, right?" I stared at the screen. I must have reread it 20 times. Owe him. Owe him what? The money my grandfather left to me. I was still trying to wrap my head around the fact that I even had an inheritance at all. And now I was supposed to feel guilty about it. I didn't reply, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I didn't trust myself not to explode. I finally called the lawyer that Friday. His name was Michael Bennett, and he sounded exactly like someone named Michael Bennett would sound. Measured, polite, slightly tired of human interaction. He confirmed everything my mother had said. The house, fully paid off and located in a quiet suburb an hour outside the city, was mine, along with an investment account worth just under $320,000. Jason, on the other hand, got the family boat, which was apparently worth around $50,000. A generous gift, but not life-changing. Michael explained it gently, like he expected me to react badly, but I was too stunned to be anything but quiet. I hadn't talked to my grandfather in almost 5 years, and yet he'd left me this, not because I was the favourite, but because, as the letter he'd written made clear, he wanted to even the scales a bit. That letter was just 2 paragraphs long, but I reread it more times than I can count. He said he'd seen how I was treated, that he admired my independence, that he was proud of the man I'd become, even if no one else ever said it out loud. I cried. I don't cry often, but I cried sitting alone on my hand-me-down couch with a letter from a man I barely knew, who somehow understood me better than my own parents. Of course, that little moment of peace didn't last. The next week, Derek called. Not texted, called, which was unusual enough that I thought maybe something had happened. Maybe he wanted to bury the hatchet, talk like grown-ups, figure this out calmly. I was stupid to think that. "Hey," he said, and I could already hear the condescending tone in his voice. "I assume you have processed everything by now." I had no idea what he meant by processed, so I stayed quiet and let him continue. He told me he was not trying to be a jerk, but then immediately started questioning why I needed any of it in the first place. Come on, man, you are single. You do not have kids, you do not have a mortgage, so what are you even going to do with all of this? I just blinked at the phone. These people really seemed to enjoy reminding me that I did not have children. I told him that I did not think that mattered. Grandpa left everything to me, and that was the end of it. There was a short silence before Jason laughed, this ugly little sound that was closer to a scoff than an actual laugh. Then he told me I knew I was not being fair. He had 3 kids, and I had no idea how expensive it was to raise 3 children. Then there was the house. I did not even want a house because I was a city guy. I could feel my grip tightening around the phone. My jaw was clenched so hard that I thought I might crack a tooth. I told Jason that I had never asked for any of this. It was not about what I wanted. Grandpa had made his decision and I was respecting it. He clearly did not like hearing that. He hung up on me. After that came the messages from Mom, Dad, and even my aunt, who I had not heard from in years. Every message was basically the same. Be the bigger person. Help your brother. Family comes first. It is only money. He needs it more than you do. You will understand when you have a family of your own someday. It honestly felt like someone had handed the entire family the same script and told them to repeat it to me. The message underneath all of it was obvious. If I refused to give Jason what he wanted, then I was selfish, immature, cold, and ungrateful. But ungrateful for what? By then, this was not even really about the money anymore. It was about control. They were realizing, maybe for the first time, that I had something they could not simply take from me or guilt me into giving away. A week later, I received an email from Michael Bennett. The subject line said, "Urgent attempted contact regarding inheritance." Apparently, Jason had contacted the law firm himself and asked whether there was some legal way to reallocate the inheritance. He had actually tried to challenge the will. Not because there had been fraud, not because there was some technical problem with the document, but simply because he believed the whole thing was unfair. The attorney explained to him politely but firmly that the will was valid. Grandpa had been of sound mind when he made it, and there were no grounds for challenging it. I thought that would finally be the end of it. It was not. That Sunday, I received a message from Mum. Transfer it to him or do not bother coming home. No hello, no explanation, just those words. I sat there with my phone in my hand, staring at the screen. Transfer it to him or do not bother coming home. This time I did not cry. I smiled. Somehow that was the moment I realized something inside me had changed. That night I did not call anyone. I did not argue with them, and I did not send some dramatic response. Instead, I booked a flight, I changed my passwords, secured my accounts, and locked down everything I could. I updated the security system at the house, which was my house now. Then I sent Michael one email authorizing him to handle all future communication with my family and told him I wanted to discuss the next steps for protecting the property. After that, I went to bed with my phone on silent. When I woke up, I had 43 missed calls and 1 voicemail from my dad that was so full of rage I could hear it in his voice. And that was only the beginning. It started out small, just like these things usually do. Little digs, passive-aggressive comments, small attempts to get under my skin. I had stupidly assumed that going low contact after Mom told me to transfer everything to Jason would finally give me some peace. Instead, it seemed to trigger something even worse. It was like I had broken some unspoken rule in our family, and now everyone was lining up to put me back in my place. I did not go home for Easter. Honestly, it was not a huge deal. I had never been a big fan of large family holidays anyway. But in the days before Easter, the messages started coming again. Mum said I could at least make an appearance because Jason's kids wanted to see their uncle. Dad told me it was not about me, Ethan. It was about family, and I needed to stop acting like a victim. Then, of course, there was Jason. He told me to enjoy spending Grandpa's money alone. I ignored all of them. I made myself a quiet dinner, watched a movie, and tried to enjoy the silence. Then the pictures started showing up on Facebook. The whole family was there in their pastel Easter clothes. Jason's kids were holding giant plastic eggs, and my parents were smiling in the background. Then, because apparently the universe wanted to make sure I got one more reminder, Mom posted a picture with a caption about being grateful for family and having all their blessings together in one room. I barely even used Facebook. I rarely checked it at all. But that night, I looked at it 3 different times. It was not because I missed them. I needed the reminder. I needed to remember how quickly they had erased me once I stopped playing the role they expected me to play. A week after Easter, I received an email from a real estate agent about Grandpa's house. The agent wanted to know whether I was still planning to list it. The strange part was that I had not contacted any real estate agent. I had not even started the process of listing the house. Confused, I called the agency. The woman on the phone was cheerful and polite, but she also sounded a little confused by my questions. She told me she had spoken with a man named Jason the previous week. He had said he was representing me as a family member and wanted to get everything moving. I almost dropped the phone. I made it clear that no, I had never authorized anyone to represent me, and I certainly had not given anyone permission to sell the house. The agent apologized repeatedly and said she would make a note in the file, but at that point, the damage had already been done. Jason had tried to put my house on the market, and he had not even done it secretly. The agent told me he had already taken photographs of the property, including pictures of the inside. That was the detail that made my stomach drop because I had never given Jason a key. So how the hell had he gotten into the house? I drove out there the following day. It was a quiet Wednesday morning, and during the hour-long drive, I could not shake the heavy feeling in my stomach. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as always, calm and almost boring, with neatly maintained lawns, older people walking little dogs, and mailboxes standing at the end of driveways with their flags raised. Then I turned into the driveway and saw something that immediately made my heart sink. There was a realtor lockbox hanging from the front doorknob, one of those big black boxes used to give agents access to a property. Jason had changed the locks. I stood there for nearly a full minute without moving, just staring at that lockbox. It was my house, my inheritance, the first real thing in my life that had ever truly belonged to me. And Jason had walked inside and started treating it like his own property without even bothering to ask. Rage does not always hit you the way movies make it look. Sometimes it comes slowly, building in waves until it takes over everything. I did not yell, and I did not hit anything. I simply pulled out my phone and started documenting everything. I photographed the lockbox, the outside of the house, and even the mailbox with my name still on it. Then I walked around the entire property while recording a video. Once I had enough evidence, I drove directly to the police station. It was the first time I had actually said the words out loud to someone who could officially document them. I think my brother broke into my house. Surprisingly, the officer treated me with sympathy. He took my statement, asked whether I had proof that I owned the property, and I told him I did. He advised me to contact a locksmith and speak with a lawyer as soon as possible. That same evening, I had every lock changed again. This time, though, I went further. I had a complete security system installed, including cameras, motion sensors, alerts, and a smart doorbell. I did not tell my family about any of it. I wanted them to believe they had no idea what I was doing. I just wanted to watch and see what happened next. Sure enough, 3 nights later, my phone suddenly lit up with an alert from the security system. Front door activity detected. I was sitting at my apartment when I opened the camera feed and saw Jason standing on the porch. He was wearing a hoodie and looking around while trying to figure out what had happened to the lockbox. The box he expected to find was gone. He looked confused at first, then angry. He grabbed the doorknob and rattled it before slowly looking directly toward the camera. Then he noticed the light and realized he was being recorded. He did not say anything, but I could see the realization on his face. He knew he had been caught. I never called him, and I never told him I had seen the footage. Still, the silence that followed felt different. It was heavy with the kind of understanding neither of us wanted to say out loud. About a week later, a certified letter arrived at my apartment. My parents had hired an attorney. The letter was written in polite legal language, but the request itself was perfectly clear. They wanted me to give up part of my rights to the estate and transfer those rights to Jason. They presented it as an act of goodwill and claimed it would help restore peace within the family. My father had signed the letter himself. Not my mother, not Jason. My father. That was the same man who had spent years telling me that I had to earn my place in this world. Now he was asking me to hand over something I had received after years of grief, distance, and quietly being the person in the family nobody seemed willing to stand up for. I did not answer the letter. Instead, I went back to Grandpa's house and sat down in his old recliner, the one my family had somehow never gotten around to selling or donating. I stayed there for a while without doing anything, just looking around the room. There was dust on the shelves, an old lamp with a crooked shade, and that faint smell of leather mixed with the feeling of a house that had seen too many years. Then I noticed something tucked behind a stack of old Reader's Digest magazines on the bottom shelf of the bookcase near the fireplace. It was a framed photograph of me and Grandpa. I did not remember when the picture had been taken. I must have been around 19 or 20 years old. We were sitting outside somewhere, probably on his porch, and I had this awkward smile on my face. Grandpa looked tired, but he also looked proud of me. Seeing that picture hit me harder than everything else that had happened. It made the whole thing real in a way that the arguments and legal letters never could. Grandpa had seen me when everyone else seemed to look right past me. I left the photograph exactly where I found it, almost like I needed it there as a reminder of why I was standing my ground. The next day, Jason sent me another message. He said I was being ridiculous and asked whether I really thought this was over. I did not respond. 2 days later, my aunt called me. She was the one who almost never called, so I knew immediately that something was wrong. She sounded like she was walking around while she talked, almost out of breath. She started by telling me that she was staying out of the situation, but then warned me that I needed to know what my parents were planning. They were going public with the whole thing. I was confused and asked what going public even meant. She explained that my parents were telling everyone they could, including our cousins, neighbors, and people from church, that I was keeping money from Jason and that Grandpa's will had somehow been manipulated. I actually laughed when I heard that. It was not funny, but the accusation was so ridiculous that I could not help myself. Manipulated? I had barely even spoken to Grandpa during the final 5 years of his life. If anything, I had always assumed Jason would end up with everything, but then I understood what they were doing. This was the plan. It had probably been the plan all along. If they could not shame me behind closed doors, they would simply take the fight into public. And sure enough, the following Sunday, the Facebook posts started appearing again. Mom posted something about how some people forget that family is a responsibility and not a competition. Dad wrote that it was sad to see what greed could do to a man. Then Jason's wife Ashley joined in too, saying that her babies did not deserve this and that all they wanted was their uncle back. And then, because nothing in my family ever seems to happen by itself, I received an email from the Human Resources Department at my job. Someone claiming to be a concerned member of the community had anonymously contacted them and suggested that I was involved in a legal dispute over contested assets and that the situation could somehow affect whether I was reliable at work. The message was carefully worded and vague enough that it could easily be dismissed, but the point was obvious. Someone had gone out of their way to put my career at risk. That was when I finally understood that this was no longer about the inheritance. It was not even really about the house. This was about power, control, and punishment. They could not accept that I had finally stood up for myself or that I now owned something they could not take away from me. So they were willing to tear everything around me apart until I finally gave in and came crawling back. But I was not going to crawl back. I was done doing that. I also did not react in the way they expected me to, and I think that confused them more than anything else. I did not send angry responses. I did not write long explanations trying to make them understand my side. I did not show up at their house demanding answers or begging them to listen. I did not even post my version of events on Facebook, which in my family was practically the same thing as taking a vow of silence. Instead, I went completely quiet. And when I say quiet, I mean I stepped as far away from everyone as I possibly could. I put my phone on silent and basically left it there. I stopped checking notifications. I deleted Facebook altogether. Eventually, I even changed my phone number. It was not something I did out of spite. I did it because I needed to. Every time my dad's name appeared on my screen or another message from Jason showed up, I could feel my chest tighten like someone had shoved a fist into it. I could not keep living that way. But I want to be honest about something. I did not do all of this because I suddenly became strong. I did it because I was exhausted. There is a point where you can reach an emotional rock bottom that does not look dramatic from the outside. You are not necessarily crying on the floor or screaming at anyone. It is quieter than that. It feels more like sitting at the bottom of an empty swimming pool, looking up at the world above you and realizing that nobody is coming down to pull you out. That was exactly where I was. I was alone inside a house filled with furniture that still felt like somebody else's, eating microwave noodles at a cheap folding plastic table because I had not had the time, energy, or motivation to bring in proper furniture yet. The house was supposed to be my inheritance, something Grandpa had left specifically to me, but instead it felt more like a battlefield. Almost every room seemed to carry some reminder of the fight I had never asked for. There was the guest bedroom Jason had tried to include in those online listing photos. There was the empty living room where my family had hosted holidays over the years without inviting me. Even the front porch had become, at least in my head, the place where the lockbox incident happened. So yes, I stopped talking to them. But cutting contact did not make the noise disappear. The stories were already spreading. My cousin Ryan texted me one night and asked if it was really true that I was suing my parents. I was not. Not yet, anyway. Somehow, though, the family rumour machine had already promoted me from being selfish to being legally hostile, and once the rumours started, the backlash followed me everywhere. Suddenly, I was supposedly the reason the family vacation had been cancelled. I was the one who had supposedly torn everyone apart. People were even saying I was making things uncomfortable for Jason's children at school. One of my old friends from high school messaged me and told me that my dad had approached his mother at church and asked people to pray for Ethan's heart. I had somehow become the villain in a story that my family had created without ever bothering to ask me what had actually happened. For a while, I let all of it get inside my head. There were several weeks when I barely wanted to leave my bed. I stopped answering emails from work. Eventually, my boss, who was actually a good guy, called me and asked if everything was okay. I lied and told him I had the flu. He gave me the rest of the week off. I spent those days watching documentaries and lying there while I stared at the ceiling fan turning above me. Then one night, I finally broke. It was not some huge, dramatic moment. I was simply standing in the bathroom brushing my teeth when I looked at myself in the mirror. My hair was a mess, my hoodie had ramen stains on it, and my eyes looked sunken and completely exhausted. I stared at my reflection and, feeling like an idiot, whispered out loud, "What if they are right? What if I really am being selfish? What if I should just give everything to Jason? What if I have turned this into something much bigger than it needs to be? Would it really be easier to just let go, hand everything over, and go back to being the quiet one who never caused problems or challenged anybody?" That thought stayed with me for the rest of the night. But something strange happened the next morning. I woke up. That was it. I just woke up. I got out of bed, took a long shower, cleaned the kitchen, and ordered an actual dining table from Wayfair. I did not suddenly have some huge motivational breakthrough. I had not watched a TikTok about healing or discovered some secret to changing my life overnight. I simply realized that the world was not going to stop because I was struggling. Nobody was coming to rescue me. If I did not want to spend the rest of my life drowning in the version of my life that my family had created for me, then I had to start building my own life instead. So that is what I slowly started doing. The first thing I decided to tackle was the house. I was not even sure I wanted to live there permanently, but I wanted the place to finally feel like mine. I wanted to take back the story that everyone else had tried to write for me. I started with the kitchen. I pulled the cabinets out myself, watched YouTube tutorials to figure out how to work with tile, and painted until my hands were cramped and sore. It was messy, slow, and way outside anything I was comfortable doing, but it gave me something I had not felt in months. I had control over something again. Eventually, the neighbours started noticing all the work I was doing. One of them was a woman named Carolyn, probably in her late 60s, who owned a dog and was apparently an excellent baker. She brought me a plate of lemon bars one day, introduced herself, and told me that she had known my grandfather. She told me that Grandpa used to stand on the porch every morning and wave to her. We ended up talking for about 20 minutes. It was nothing serious or emotional, just a normal conversation between two people, and I realized I had not had one of those in a very long time. I did not realize how much I had missed simply being seen as a person until I stopped constantly hiding behind guilt. The house slowly started changing, and somewhere along the way, I started changing too. At work, I finally found my rhythm again. I got involved with a new client project and started taking on a few more calls. My boss noticed the difference and eventually gave me a raise. He told me that I seemed different lately, but in a good way. I smiled, thanked him, and left it at that. I never told him that the reason I felt different was because I had finally stopped carrying a family on my back that had never really carried me. As for the inheritance, I did not waste it. I did not go out and buy a sports car or spend a month in Bora Bora. Instead, I sat down with a financial advisor. He was a smart guy, but more importantly, he explained everything in a way that made me feel like an adult instead of a clueless kid. With his help, I divided the money into 3 separate parts. One portion went into savings, another went into investments, and the third was for what he called joy spending. I actually liked that idea. I decided to use the Joy Fund for one thing. I booked myself a solo trip to Kyoto. Just me, a backpack, and absolutely no schedule. When I told Carolyn about it, she immediately lit up. She told me that her grandfather had always wanted to visit Japan but never got the chance. And then she said he would probably be proud of the man I was becoming. For some reason, those words hit me harder than I expected. Maybe it was because nobody else had ever said anything like that to me. Not once, not even close. But I realized that I really was becoming someone. And maybe it was not despite everything that had happened to me, but partly because of it. Of course, the silence from my family did not last forever. After several peaceful months, the messages started showing up again, but this time they sounded different. Jason messaged me on WhatsApp, of all places. It was just a simple request asking if we could talk. I did not answer. Then an email came from Mom saying that they missed me and that Jason's kids were asking about me. There was still no mention of the house, the will, the threats, or anything they had done. It was just another vague message filled with guilt, clearly designed to pull me back into the family. I sat with it for a while and wondered whether I should respond. Instead, I reached for the old photograph of Grandpa and me, the one I had found behind the magazines on the bookshelf, and placed it on my new desk beside my laptop. By then, the house smelled completely different. There was fresh paint, clean wood, and even a little lemon scent from the candles I had started lighting while working from home. It finally felt like my place. More importantly, I finally felt like I belonged to myself. That realization meant everything because for the first time in my life, I did not feel like I had to prove anything to my family. I did not need to prove my worth, my success, or even my right to exist on my own terms. I never replied to Mum's message, but I also did not hate them. I simply understood that I did not belong to them anymore. And more than anything else, that was where my real recovery began. It is strange how quiet clarity can be. It does not happen like it does in movies. There is no dramatic music, no perfect moment, and no slow walk into the sunset. It is just a series of small, deliberate choices that slowly become stronger than anything you could say out loud. You stop asking for permission. You stop waiting for people to become different. You stop explaining yourself to people who have already decided they do not want to hear your side. And little by little, you start thinking like someone who finally understands what he is worth. That was exactly where I found myself. A full year had passed since Grandpa's will was read. During that year, I had taken the house that once felt like a battlefield and turned it into an actual home. My home. The kitchen now had subway tile that I had installed myself. The study smelled like books and coffee instead of dust and resentment. The guest room had become this peaceful little space filled with plants and sunlight. I even gave that room a name. I called it Room B, after my grandfather Samuel. I never told anyone about that. It was something I kept as my own private tribute to him. Financially, I was doing well. Actually, I was doing better than well. My job had promoted me twice, my savings were in good shape, and my investments were growing. Even my mind felt clearer than it ever had before. And yet, there was still one thing I could not completely let go of. It was not the house, it was not the money, it was the betrayal. I could forgive someone for making an honest mistake. People make mistakes all the time, but what my family had done was not some accidental mistake. They had thought it through. They had deliberately tried to take something that belonged to me, not because they were starving or had nowhere to live, but because they genuinely believed it should belong to them. Jason had children. I was just Ethan. That was how they had always looked at it. In their minds, I only seemed to matter when I was the one being asked to sacrifice something. And the worst part was that they still believed they had won because I had gone quiet. They did not understand that my silence was not surrender. It was strategy. That became even clearer when I found the old group photograph. It was taken about 2 years before Grandpa died, during Thanksgiving. Everyone was packed together in the backyard, smiling for the camera and pretending we were not secretly annoyed with one another. My parents stood in the center. Jason was there with his arms around his wife and kids. My aunt and uncle were standing off to the left. And then there was me, pushed all the way to the far edge of the picture, barely visible because part of my body was hidden behind a tree branch. I had not seen that photograph in years, but looking at it now made something click. I remembered exactly how that picture had been taken. I had been the one who set it up. I put the camera on a tripod, turned on the timer, and told everyone where to stand. Then I had to sprint across the yard to get into the picture before the timer went off. And somehow, when everyone settled into place, I ended up shoved toward the edge so Jason could stand in the middle. Typical. I stared at that photograph for a long time, and then another memory came back to me. Jason had made a toast that day. It was one of those overly polished speeches he liked to give. Something about legacy, family, and everyone sticking together. Everyone applauded like Jason was John F. Kennedy come back from the dead. I still remembered the way he had looked at me from the other side of the table, like I had already been written off and he had already decided that everything in the family would eventually belong to him anyway. That was when it finally hit me. My family had always acted like the family legacy belonged to Jason by default, but now I was the one who actually owned it, and I knew exactly how I wanted to remind them. The first step was the house. I did not just want to live there, I wanted to turn it into something people could see, something that made the message impossible to miss. This was never yours. So I hired an architect. His name was Daniel, and he happened to be a former classmate of mine who had eventually started his own design firm in the city. We had never been especially close in college, but we had run into each other at a seminar the previous spring, exchanged contact information, and stayed loosely connected. I told him that I wanted to restore the house without destroying what made it special. I wanted to modernize the inside while keeping the original structure and preserving the character Grandpa had left behind. Daniel immediately understood what I was going for. As he walked through the rooms with a sketchbook in his hand, he pointed out the details and said he loved the style. He described it as 1950s Americana with subtle craftsman influences and said we could really bring those original elements back to life. I watched him run his hand along the old windowsills and thought about what I wanted the house to represent. I wanted it to feel like something a person had earned, not something they had simply inherited. Daniel never pushed me for personal details or asked unnecessary questions. He just understood the project and got to work. I paid him up front. There is a certain feeling that comes with writing a check without having to stop and worry about whether you can afford it. Nothing says freedom quite like that. The second step was building the paper trail. I started collecting every document I could possibly get my hands on. I gathered the will, the property deed, all the emails from Michael Bennett, the police report from the incident when Jason tried to get into the house, screenshots of my family's social media posts, and every message I had received from Jason, my parents, and my aunt. I put everything into one organized digital folder and separated it into categories like legal matters, emotional abuse, property dispute, public slander, and online harassment. I was not doing it because I had already decided to sue anyone. I wanted to have the option if it ever became necessary. I had finally learned that power was not simply about money or getting revenge. Real power was having leverage. And when you had spent your entire life being treated like the person who would never fight back, there was nothing more unsettling for people like that than discovering you had quietly kept records of everything they had done. The third step was asking questions. But I did not ask my family. I started talking to the people around them instead. It began with Carolyn, my neighbor. She had known Grandpa and used to sit with him on the porch and talk for long stretches. She remembered more than I expected. One afternoon, while we were sitting in her backyard drinking iced tea, I casually asked if she knew Jason had tried to sell the house. Her eyes immediately widened. She asked what I meant, and I told her that he had actually brought a real estate agent there before everything involving the will had even been completely settled. Carolyn just stared at me for a second before saying that Grandpa would have been furious. I gave her a small smile and said he probably was. We laughed about it, but inside my head, I was already putting pieces together. After that, I started reaching out to other people who had known Grandpa over the years. I talked to some of his friends from church, an old fishing buddy, and even the guy at the local hardware store who used to sell him birdseed every spring. Most of them remembered me. Some only remembered me vaguely, while others had much warmer memories than I expected. Then one woman, Mrs. Carter, who had known Grandpa from Sunday choir, told me something over the phone that completely stopped me. She said Grandpa had once told her he was worried my family would eat me alive if he did not step in. I had to swallow before I could even respond. Then she continued and told me exactly what he had said about me. Grandpa believed I was a good person. He said I was not loud or demanding, but that good men could easily get pushed aside if nobody stepped in for them. That was the moment I understood something. This was not just about winning an argument with my family anymore, it was about taking responsibility for honoring what Grandpa had tried to protect when he made that decision, so I started writing everything down. It was not a revenge letter, and I was not writing it for my family, I was writing it for myself. I wrote down every comment they had ever made that was designed to make me feel small. I wrote about every time they treated me like a burden, every gift Jason received that I did not, every chore I handled while everyone else sat around watching television, and every family gathering where I somehow ended up being the person nobody thought about until they needed something. I wrote down every moment when I had allowed them to make me question whether I was actually worth loving. Then I made another list. This one was about everything I had accomplished despite all of that. I had earned my degree, I had worked 2 jobs at the same time, I had paid off my debt, I had bought my first car, I had earned promotions, I had travelled alone, and I had taken a house that felt like a battlefield and rebuilt it into something that was finally mine. The list was much longer than I expected. At the very bottom, I wrote one final sentence. I will no longer apologise for the person I had to become to survive the people who refused to see me. I folded that paper and placed it in the drawer beside my bed. I did not need to read it every day. I simply wanted it there, because maybe someday my family would see it. And if that day ever came, I wanted them to know that I had remembered everything. The final part of my plan came almost by accident. Daniel had finished the blueprints, the permits had been submitted, and the renovation work was already underway. One day, as we walked through the house looking at the early changes, Daniel ran his hand along the new stair railing and said something that stayed with me. He told me the place had history and that if it were his, he would give it a name. I looked at him and asked what he meant by naming it. He shrugged and explained that people named properties all the time, especially houses with some kind of history or family legacy. He told me there was something special about this place. That night I sat alone in the living room, my living room, staring into the fireplace. And then the name came to me, the Samuel House. It was not flashy, it was not dramatic. It was simply his name, Grandpa's name. And somehow that felt exactly right, like a quiet echo of everything he had given me. It was not only about the inheritance anymore, it was also about the fact that Grandpa had believed I was someone worth fighting for. The next day I filed the paperwork, built a simple website, and registered the property as a small retreat for writers and artists. I booked the first guest for the summer, an author I knew who needed somewhere quiet where she could finally finish her novel. Just like that, the house started becoming something completely different. It was no longer just a reminder of everything that had happened. It became a purpose, a way for me to rewrite the meaning of what had been left behind, my legacy. And my family still had no idea what was coming. But they would find out because I was nowhere near finished. The housewarming invitation was never really meant for them, but I sent one to them anyway. It was a simple, cream-coloured card with clean embossed lettering that said they were cordially invited to the reopening of the Samuel House, a creative retreat and legacy home. It included the date, the time, and the website with an optional request to RSVP. There was no signature and no explanation. I sent invitations to my parents' address, to Jason's house, and even to my aunt, the same aunt who had once told me that family sticks together, but not everyone is glue. I knew they would receive them. I knew the invitation would get under their skin. And honestly, that was part of the reason I sent it. The official reopening was not some huge event. There were maybe 30 people there, mostly artists, writers, neighbours, and a few people I knew from work. But when they walked inside, the difference was obvious. The house had been completely transformed. The main living area was open and bright, with clean Scandinavian lines mixed with warm details that kept the original character of the house alive. The dining room still had Grandpa's old table, but now it sat underneath a chandelier I had found at a vintage shop. The back porch had been rebuilt from the ground up, facing the woods with a wraparound railing and string lights hanging overhead. It was not some giant mansion or extravagant palace, it was something much simpler. It was dignity. Above the front door, I had placed a new sign that read, "The Samuel House, established 1957, reclaimed 2025. It was subtle, but I knew exactly how much that little sign would say without me having to explain anything. Jason found the website before the opening. I knew because he messaged me the night before. He asked what the hell I was doing and why I had turned Grandpa's house into a business. I sat there drinking tea while I looked at his message for a while. Then I finally responded that I had turned it into something that gave back. I reminded him that he had tried to sell it, while Grandpa had left it to me. That was all I said, and honestly, that was enough. The revenge was never supposed to be some explosive confrontation. I did not need lawsuits, screaming matches, or some dramatic showdown in front of the whole family. I had something better. Visibility. Now anyone who knew them could see what had actually happened. Their church friends could see it. The neighbors could see it. Old family friends who had gone quiet over the years, but still checked Facebook like it was the evening news, could see it too. I had posted the entire renovation process on the website as a blog. There were photographs, progress updates, and even a short video tour narrated by Daniel. In the opening credits, I included a dedication to Samuel Moore, a man who had seen value in me when everyone else seemed to see nothing but silence. I did not write it as some attack against my family. It was not meant to be petty, but they took it personally anyway. A few days after the website launched, Mom finally called me. I did not answer. She left a voicemail instead. Her voice sounded tight and controlled, like she was trying very hard to keep her emotions from breaking through. She said that she and Dad were disappointed by the way I had handled everything. According to her, there had been ways to include the family, but I had chosen to make the entire situation about myself. She ended by saying it was sad, Ethan. Really sad. I saved the voicemail. I listened to it exactly once, and then I never played it again. I already understood how my family worked. Whenever I took control of my own life, they called it selfish. Whenever I created a boundary, they called it betrayal. Whenever I achieved something without them, they treated it like a threat. But this time, they had no control over me, and that was the real revenge. It was not the money, it was not the house, it was not the website, the retreat guests, or even the growing list of bookings. The real revenge was that they no longer mattered to me. When someone loses the ability to hurt you, especially after knowing exactly how much power they once had over you, that kind of silence can be more frustrating to them than any argument. Still, I was not finished. There was one more thing I wanted to do. I hired a videographer, a local filmmaker I had met at a community arts event. I explained that I wanted to make a short documentary for the website and my YouTube channel. Nothing massive, maybe 10 minutes long. She asked what the documentary would be about, and I told her the truth. It was about legacy. It was about taking back something that had been taken from you emotionally, even when nobody had technically stolen it. It was about what can happen when one person quietly invests in the black sheep of a family and believes in him when everyone else has decided he does not matter. She loved the idea. We spent an entire week filming. She recorded the renovation work, the letters Grandpa had written, old family photographs I'd discovered in storage, and conversations with Carolyn and Mrs. Carter. I narrated most of the documentary myself. My voice shook during some of the more difficult parts, but I decided not to hide that. I wanted people to hear the emotion instead of pretending I'd been completely unaffected by everything. We called the finished video "The House He Gave Me," a quiet inheritance. I uploaded it and honestly had no idea what would happen next. Within 2 weeks, it reached 20,000 views. I never expected that many people to watch it. Then the messages started coming in from complete strangers. People told me that the story felt familiar, that they had families where they were always treated like the invisible one too. One man told me he had cried while watching the documentary. A woman emailed me and said it had inspired her to go back to school at 42. Another person told me she wanted to visit the house because she had not written poetry in 10 years. But after watching the video, she picked up a pen again. I saved every single message I received, not because I needed strangers to tell me I was right, but because those messages reminded me that I was not the only person who had ever felt invisible in their own family. Then the fallout started. It began when one of my dad's co-workers apparently watched the documentary. I only found out because my cousin texted me and said Uncle Robert was losing his mind because someone at his office had shared my video during lunch, and Dad was furious that I was putting private family history online. That actually made me smile, because that was what they were really afraid of, wasn't it? They were not afraid that I was making things up. They were afraid that I was telling the truth and that other people were actually believing me. Soon after that, my aunt removed me from every social media platform she could. My mother posted a long, angry message about narcissists who rewrite history and manipulate the past to make themselves look like victims. Jason went completely silent for a while. Then one night, I received something I honestly did not expect. A real letter, a handwritten letter from Jason. It was 2 pages long. The first half was basically anger dressed up as polite language. He said that I had portrayed him unfairly, that he had never actually intended to take anything from me, and that everything he had done was supposedly about protecting what he believed was the family legacy. But toward the end, his tone changed. The anger faded, and the words became much quieter. He admitted that he did not understand why Grandpa had chosen me, and said he did not think he would ever completely understand it. But then he wrote that it was obvious Grandpa had seen something in me that the rest of them had missed, and maybe they had simply been too busy looking at themselves to notice. That sentence stayed with me. It was probably the closest thing to an apology I was ever going to receive from him. Still, I did not write back. I did not feel like I needed to. I had finally learned that forgiveness and access were two completely different things. Jason and the rest of my family could work through their feelings whenever they were ready, but they were not going to do it inside my house. The Samuel House officially opened for its first full retreat in May. 4 writers, 2 painters, and 1 digital artist came and stayed for 10 days. I cooked for everyone on the weekends. We spent evenings talking on the porch, sitting around bonfires and sharing stories about healing, creativity, failure, and what it actually means to start over. One night, one of the writers, a woman from Vermont, looked around the house and told me that the place felt like it had been created by someone who understood what it was like to have something important to say and nobody willing to listen. I smiled and told her that I did understand. She nodded and simply said that I was heard now. And she was right. I was finally being heard by people who actually mattered. People who saw me as more than a wallet, more than the family scapegoat, and more than the person who was supposedly never doing enough. They saw me as someone who had taken something broken and rebuilt it into a legacy that was actually worth passing on. That fall, I planted a tree in the backyard, a sugar maple. Grandpa had always loved those trees. After I finished digging and planted it, I stood there with dirt covering my hands while the sun was going down. For the first time, I said the words out loud. Thank you for choosing me. The wind moved through the branches, and for just a second, I swear it felt like I had received an answer. By then, I understood that this was no longer about revenge. It was about restoration. It was about becoming the man my family had spent years trying to erase and doing it without asking them for permission. I never told my family everything I was building at the Samuel House, but I think they eventually figured it out on their own, because legacy is not simply the things someone leaves you. It is what you decide to do with what they gave you. And finally, I had done something nobody in my family had been willing to do. I chose to start over, quietly, slowly, and permanently.